Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday Shot. A bit of a different experience this week because we have dragooned Dave into being involved from his European sojourn. But in order to ensure that we weren't recording in the dead of night, we pre-recorded late last night, so to bring you this show this morning. It is a European special, but because we did have the very significant decision taken by Murray Watt this week of the extension of the North West Shelf gas facility until 2070, we're going to bring you first an interview with the Climate Council's Greg Bourne about the implications of that decision. And then we're going to head straight into our normal panel discussion featuring Dave with eminent panellists Natasha Cica from Belgrade and Georgina Godwin from London. Dave currently in Spain. So enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for, as ever, watching the Sunday Shot. Greg Bourne, thank you very much for joining the Sunday Shot.
Delighted to be there, Jo.
So this week we saw the first major decision from the Albanese government, perhaps an inevitable one. Murray Watt's announcing that he was approving the extension of the North West Shelf gas facility until 2070. Can you tell us what is happening over there at the moment? What is the North West Shelf facility? What does it do, and how much gas does it produce?
Yeah, sure. So the gas facility really talks about the area on land where the gas is brought in from a number of gas fields. There it is processed, cooled, liquefied, and eventually most of it goes offshore to Japan, Korea, China, and a small amount goes down the West Australian pipeline down towards Perth and slightly south of Perth. So it's a plant that's been there since sort of built in the late 80s. It was due to close around about 2030, and this decision on the environmental grounds is that it should be able to stay open until 2070, which to me spells a disaster.
So environmentalists have called it a disaster. They're naming it a carbon bomb. What exactly is it going to mean for the amount of emissions now that we will continue to be emitting?
Right. So the decision was basically, in one sense, a narrow decision with regard to environmental significance and cultural significance of some of the rock art, which is just about 35 kilometres away from the plant. And that plant, with its let's call it the local emissions, usually it's acidified atmosphere in a sense, could wear away that rock art, which has been there for about 50,000 years, and destroy a cultural significance and environmental significance.
And that's the emissions that the facility itself, as part of its industrial processes, is emitting.
So in a sense, Murray Watt has made a decision on the absolute narrowest of decision-making processes. He did not have to, and he does not under that particular law, have to consider the emissions that occur when they go overseas and are burnt in China, Japan, Korea, and so on like that. The amount of emissions that would be burnt between now and 2070 would be something like 4 to 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's absolutely enormous. But there is one particular point I think that we should look at. This decision for Woodside is basically one of the doors they need to have opened in order to open the Browse gas field, which has not yet been opened up. And it's that they want. That is what they want.
Right. So we're looking at kind of two stages of environmental catastrophe, if you like. What this decision itself does in terms of with the Scope 3 emissions that are then as a result of the gas being burned through the export market. But because this has been opened, it facilitates the opening up of further exploration and exploitation on the Browse facility.
Yeah, look, absolutely. The Browse gas field has been known about for a long time. It really has been known for a long time. And the question was, whether it would be developed. The process for a company like Woodside is to think through how can they open all of the doors, so the environmental door, if you like, the safety law, the pollution at sea law, the running of the plant, and then eventually the decommissioning of the plant. So they're wanting to open all of these doors one by one by one. And they have been thinking, yes, this will run out to 2070. At the same time, the world is thinking about how can we get to net zero by 2050. Oh, and by the way, that includes Woodside. They don't get outside of it. And yet they are levering this door open and putting pressure on the government, as all previous governments, and they want desperately to get the Browse gas field to come through new and enhanced plant at Karratha.
So we can understand why Woodside wants this. They are just all about their own profits. But the Albanese government, which notionally has a commitment to net zero, its justification has been all about the domestic market and the need for gas to be a transitional energy as we get to renewables. Talk us through both of those. First of all, this idea that we need to firm capacity was the term that was being used by Prime Minister Albanese. That doesn't seem to stack up given how much of the gas from this facility is exported.
Look, I think the Prime Minister just, a couple of days ago has dug himself a very, very deep hole. He answered the questions about the gas, if you like, off the top of his head, because he's used to discussing things in the East Coast with regard to, the Bass Strait is beginning to diminish in gas and so on like that. And do we need gas on the East Coast, for heating, for, engineering purposes or chemical purposes? And he answered it as if that was a thing that matters. This particular gas field, none of it will come to the East Coast. Less of it needs to be going down to Perth as Perth begins to move more and more into a renewable energy stage. A huge amount of sun over there. I come from Perth myself, so I know about the sun. I know about the solar energy that's available there. So he's actually, as I say, dug himself a hole. He's answered as if it was for the East Coast. This has got nothing to do with the East Coast, nothing whatsoever. So Woodside absolutely are basically trying to say, we want to run our gas field and the new gas field in the Browse Basin right out to 2070. To be damned with the world, it doesn't matter. Our job is to remunerate shareholders, make sure that those dividends come out each and every single year. And other people in Australia can pick up the slack of trying to get to net zero by 2050, but we'll keep going to 2070. Unbelievably cynical.
And one of the other answers that Mr. Albanese gave was, in a very kind of emphatic way and a slightly annoyed way, was it's net zero, not zero. As if somehow this huge increase in emissions that's about to take place, whether here or as part of, because we're exporting, can be offset in other ways. Can you talk to us a little bit about the different strategies that we're trying to use to offset and how successful they could be at all, and then to offset emissions of this scale?
Yeah, look, there's I'll call it sort of two types of offsets. One of them would be, for example, where one particular type of company, by bringing in new technology, reduces its emissions really quite dramatically, more than they are required to, and they effectively could sell those I'll call them industrial offsets, to a Woodside who doesn't actually reduce their emissions, but they offset them by buying them across the border and so on like that. The second type of offset that people often talk about are, the land use based offsets, which are, some of them are legit, some of them are very chonky, some are not permanent and endurable in this changing climate. So when you actually then look at the target of net zero that we see for Australia, you see each of the different sectors coming down: the transport sector, the industrial sector, the resources sector. But you actually see the netting off amount going up and up and up. And yet we don't actually have some really solid work with regard to agricultural offsets and deforestation, afforestation offsets, certainly not to the amount that's shown on the charts. So again, I think he's answered swiftly off the top of his head, and I think he's going to have to dig himself out of a ditch really quite carefully, because at the moment we are going to head for a pretty poor target at this stage, and especially if this were to go out to 2070. He is going to have to get back on track and really understand what Woodside are trying to do. And the way I look at it is Woodside and my former company that I used to work with BP, are basically saying, this energy transition is going too slow, so we're not going to do any of the renewable energy stuff anymore. We're going to get back and just pump out gas, drill for more oil and so on like that, and others can fix this up. And it's very interesting that the CEO of Woodside almost used exactly the same words as the CEO of BP to say, oh, we in our particular business, we can see that the transition is going too slow, so we'll just keep going fast.
Murray Watt said when he was talking about his decision on ABC Radio, he said, whatever a decision I make, there'll be lots of people unhappy. And it is true there are people who are unhappy, but it never seems to be the fossil fuel companies who are made unhappy. We have obviously traditional owners, the Aboriginal communities, the rock art that you talked about, allies, people who value cultural heritage. And we also had some very sharp words coming from our Pacific neighbours who are really at the front line of this issue. Neighbours that, Penny Wong and Albanese had tried to be building bridges with over climate, but, they're not so happy with us now.
Yeah, look, I recall the picture of the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, at one of the previous COPs where he's, sitting and talking to all the people, and then the camera pans out and you actually see that he is sitting in sort of like a meter of water. Clearly, our neighbours in the Pacific will see this as a disastrous step forward, and they need to be completely on board if we, Australia, are going to host COP31. And my sense will be that basically they will put off the decision and to see whether the Prime Minister will actually show a bit more direction and determination to cut Australia's emissions, not only Australia's emissions domestically, but the vast amount of emissions that are caused when we send our coal and our liquefied natural gas overseas. And the way I look at it, Joe, this might sound mean and horrible, but I've said that we're actually purveying these products with the zeal of a drug lord. We don't give a damn about what's happening in the future. We are not working with the consumers of the product we sell to reduce the overall trade. And that's what we actually have to do. We have to reduce this trade, which is like a drug to us. It actually feeds us lots and lots of money, but it wreaks havoc in the future.
And it does seem kind of extraordinary that you've got a Labor government who's full of people who profess to care about climate change, and yet then when it comes to these sorts of decisions and as you say, the ongoing purveying of fossil fuels via export, they don't seem to care.
Look, I think the way I would look at it is basically the Prime Minister has probably got something like 3 months, and I will say 3 months, in which to begin to show that he's going to bring in a climate trigger on some of the projects that we have perhaps in the pipeline, which may actually get shut down. So I would expect to see at some stage rather a trigger which would stop Browse Basin going ahead and some of the coal mine extensions going ahead. And the reason I say 3 months is the decision of whether we have COP31 will be made maybe in June, but it could be put off until September or October. So there might be a window in which the Labor government move forward. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the Labor government have done quite a lot about moving things forward, way more than the previous coalition governments, absolutely. But now is the time to accelerate, when we need to accelerate these mitigation activities, because we are seeing an acceleration of the heating. We are seeing an acceleration of the numbers of extreme weather events, some of them absolutely disastrous, and some of them so tragically recent, up in New South Wales and then prior to that in Queensland. This is accelerating. We actually have to accelerate the mitigation process.
Now, today we have a special panel Dave, as regular viewers will know, is currently in Europe. Dave, thank you very much for getting up early and being part of today's broadcast.
Not a worry. I would absolutely rather be here than at the beach.
I hope you're having a grand time on your grand tour. We are also delighted to be joined by a Serbian-Australian writer and director of change consultancy capacity.org, Natasha Cica. Thank you very much for joining us, Natasha.
Thanks so much, Jo.
She is currently in Serbia on the ground there, about an hour outside of Belgrade. And British broadcaster and co-host of Monocle Radio's current affairs show, The Globalist, Georgina Godwin. Thank you, Georgina.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
And you've just got back from Sydney as well after being with us here at the Sydney Writers' Festival.
I have. It was great. And before that at Auckland. But I have to say I'm still grappling with jet lag a tiny bit.
Yeah, no, it's a long way to fly. That's absolutely true. And we know that you're about to head off after this as well and go and be part of yet another storied Writers' Festival up at Hay, which is one of my favourite literary festivals in the world.
It's going to be fun, but I'm looking forward to doing this first.
Yes. Now, today is going to be all about Europe in honour of Dave's trip there, and also because there is a lot going on in Europe at the moment, it's fair to say. Most of Europe is having to go through a kind of recalibration given the chaos which is taking place in DC. So Europe as an entity in some ways is looking at a new world order. And then within countries in Europe, there's a lot of unrest and volatility. And in particular, we are seeing the rise in a lot of countries of populist movements that are gaining more support than ever before. So we thought we'd we'd divide up our conversation essentially into those two halves and start with really how Europe is coping with the second Trump administration. And Georgina, if I can start with you, because you have a newish government. They must be coming up to nearly their 12-month anniversary. And the way that Britain is now having to recalibrate all of its foreign policy, in particular its relationship with the EU, has really changed since the ascension of Trump 2.0. How is Starmer doing generally? And perhaps we can talk first both domestically and then in relation to the broader relationships that it has.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bruising few years in British politics. The Conservative Party, after 14 years in power, didn't just lose the election, they were absolutely annihilated. They crashed from a commanding majority to just over 120 seats. They were wiped out in Wales, they were obliterated in swathes of the south. I mean, it wasn't a blip, it was a complete reckoning. So that vacuum handed Labour a landslide, over 400 seats. But the mood wasn't jubilant. This wasn't a wave of inspiration like Blair in 97. It was more of a weary sigh of relief. Finally, some adults in the room after Johnson, after Truss, after Rishi Sunak. Starmer came in with a promise of quiet competence. He was serious, lawyerly, no nonsense, a stabiliser really. But here we are, nearly a year on, and things are flat. His approval ratings have tanked. He's now less popular than Rishi Sunak was at his worst. Only about 23% of voters see him favourably, and even among Labour supporters, the shine is wearing off. And that, I think, is partly because he's offering caution when the country wants vision, and partly because he's trying to outflank a new threat on the right, and that's Reform UK. So that's Nigel Farage's party, the artist formerly known as the Brexit Party. This week, Farage was in full showman mode. He was laying out eye-catching pledges, raising the income tax threshold to £20,000, slashing green spending, cutting so-called woke programmes, and taking crypto donations. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's populist politics, pure and simple. And it's gaining traction. I mean, some polls have leapfrogged reform leapfrogging the Tories altogether. And Starmer, rather than holding his ground, seems to be chasing their tail. He's talking about taking back control of borders, warning the UK could become an island of strangers. Very bad reaction to that. I mean, all of it sounds suspiciously like a lurch to the right, which is alienating even more parts of his base. And so, of course, Europe is watching all of this with bemused interest. Starmer's talked about resetting relationships with the EU, but from Brussels' point of view, Britain still looks confused about what it wants to be post-Brexit. I mean, Labour may be in charge, but it's not setting the pace that reform is. So technically, Labour is governing, but politically, they're on the back foot.
I mean, a lot of that does sound very familiar for Australian ears, I have to say, that kind of there's not being a sense of jubilation about a thumping majority, about a government that's being very, very cautious, that is keeping an eye on the politics at all times rather than seizing the mandate and using the majority that it has to do things. I mean, just from afar, it does seem that everything that Labor could do and really needs to do after the long grinding austerity of the Conservative government, it is failing to do, even as the success of some of these populist parties is to do with rejection of the establishment and rejection of establishment positions.
I mean, I suppose to be fair to Labour, they inherited an absolute disaster. And honestly, there was such a wave of support for them, but rather as a rejection of the Tories than a love-in for Labour, that there was almost nowhere for them to go except to fail. There was such high expectations. The country was in such a mess. And Starmer, I'm afraid, just in trying to steady the ship, just isn't delivering. It's not what British people want. And I think it's worrying Europe.
And there was last week the so-called reset of the relationship with Europe. So they did finally negotiate around some of the really intractable issues around borders, trade, fishing rights, starting to look at defence, starting to look at some of these sort of free movement of young people, those types of issues. How do you think, I mean, and Starmer certainly seems to be much more in it with Macron, with Merz, with some of the big international issues, he is lining up with them. How is he managing those relationships, and how do you think the EU is perceiving him?
You know, the problem is that Starmer has been absolutely clear that he is not going to go back on Brexit, which is what I think the majority of the country would like. We hate Brexit. We want to go back to pre that time. He's been very clear he's not going to do that. It is possible he could do it. He is making these concessions. We are slowly coming to some deals, but it's just not enough. I mean, from this summer, for instance, it looks like Britons will no longer be able to use the e-gates at airports, at European airports. Can you imagine what that's going to do to free movement? I mean, it's going to be an absolute disaster with people coming in and out of France and Spain and so on holiday, and suddenly massive queues. And that alone is enough to really alienate voters.
Sure. Why is that? Why? Surely they can do some kind of deal, or is that the EU kind of punishing?
I think, yeah, a lot of this is about the EU going, not so fast. You made your bed, now you lie in it.
Dave, how are you finding it on the ground in Europe at the moment?
I mean, part of the reason for this trip was just to tune out, because I've been writing about genocide for 2 years. So I have been trying to just have a little moment to not do that. But I'm in Spain at the moment. I chatted with a British woman yesterday that used to own a restaurant here. Once Brexit happened, she ended up needing to sell it. It's difficult for her to come here. And she says she just spends her time in the UK at home, pissed off, not talking to everybody, because she just resents everybody around her for that outcome. And what I'm hearing Georgina say about the UK Labour Party, and as you pointed out, it is wholly reminiscent of what we're seeing with the Australian Labour Party. And I think to a degree the Democrats in the state, where we have a mood for real change, where we want people to address growing wealth inequalities out of control in the West. And we have establishment parties positioning as the left-wing option, but unwilling to tackle this particular issue. And that is, it's just setting up ripe ground for people like Nigel Farage to come along and blame it on brown people. And here we go again, basically.
Mm. And Natasha, we're going to get on to the real volatility of Serbian politics a bit later. But just in terms of the sense in Serbia and in the parts of Europe that you are, is that mood of discontent, of volatility, of sort of discombobulation there as well?
Yes, my assessment is the situation here is extremely unstable and it's very unclear what's going to happen. There have been demonstrations running here against the elected Vučić government now for 6 months, and a lot of geopolitical turbulence happening around it. And so it's like watching a giant chess game with Serbia sort of wedged in the middle of a lot of great power agendas. And yes, indeed, the current president has close relationships with European leaders and other leaders on the far right. And so we just don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Day by day.
Yeah. I mean, and it is interesting that, you know, Trump, and that is, you know, the orange shadow that hangs over everything. But the European Union has had to turn inward and to start thinking about itself as an entity in different ways because of Trump occupying the White House again. Georgina, how do you think that they're doing? I mean, there's been a sort of a change of leaders generally. We lost Merkel, who was kind of the mother of Europe, and then her successor, Scholz, was quite short-lived. And really, when he was turfed out, it was a very comprehensive defeat, and we saw the far right for the first time coming in the second position, Alternative for Deutschland, with glowing support now from JD Vance and Elon Musk as well, of course. But, I mean, that was a real transformation at the very heart of European leadership. And now we're seeing they try to forge stronger ties and to become a more united entity. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Serbia is a kind of weather vane. What we're seeing there, the consolidation of power, the national rhetoric, the ambivalence towards Moscow, that's playing out across the continent in different shades. You've got Hungary, Viktor Orban's turned illiberal democracy into official policy. He's hollowed out independent media in the courts. He's consistently blocked EU attempts to support Ukraine, and he's not hiding it. He's aligned with Putin on a lot of fronts. Then there's Portugal, shock results this week, really surprised people. The Chega party, hard right, anti-immigration, deeply Eurosceptic, has gone from fringe player to the main opposition. I mean, that's in a country we've long thought of as centrist and stable, and it's not isolated. In Austria, the far right Freedom Party is likely to lead the next government. In France, support for Marine Le Pen remains strong despite her legal troubles. Germany, as you say, the AfD is polling in second place nationally, even after a string of scandals and attempts to ban parts of the party. And I think it isn't just about angry populism anymore. The far right is becoming institutional. It's getting disciplined. It's wearing suits. It's entering parliament. And in many cases, it's chipping away at support for Ukraine, not with outright rejection, but with a kind of slow attritional doubt. Is it worth it? What's in it for us? Should we be focusing on our own borders first? And this matters hugely because the European Parliament elections are coming up. And if the far right performs as strongly as expected, which all of the polling suggests that they will, it could shift the centre of gravity in Brussels. And that in turn, of course, could affect everything from defence spending to sanctions and even future aid packages for Kyiv. So the stakes are high, and not just for Ukraine, but for the very idea of a unified European response. If Europe fractures politically, the support Ukraine has, and if that starts to wobble, that plays right into into Putin's hands, and the next year could be the point where we find out whether Europe doubles down on solidarity or starts to turn inward. And of course, this is hugely dependent on the US. Does Europe need its own version of NATO? Do we need a defense pact? How much can the United States be relied on? What's going to happen to the Democrats? Is there any kind of fight back? We are in an unprecedented era in world politics, and I'm afraid I'm very worried.
I mean, you can hear that in your voice. And of course, being over there, you would be feeling, and we're observers from here, but you would be feeling it very keenly. I mean, at the moment, there did seem to be this sense that the current cohort of leaders is very much saying, we will double down on support for Ukraine. We now have to work out how we can provide that support without the US as that traditional backstop. Why is it, do you think? I mean, there is Ukraine. It is the absolute front line of the war and the sort of détente between Russia and the West. Why would Europe be so cavalier about that? Why is this shift taking place?
I mean, I think that institutionally, Brussels, the EU, is not cavalier about it at all. They are, and
no.
France absolutely doubling down, and Britain, we're going to support Ukraine whatever happens. But it is the dangerous people like Hungary, who's right in the heart of the EU and fighting against it, blocking all sorts of resolutions. And this shift to the right is just informing how it speaks. And as I say, the real danger will come with the EU parliamentary elections, because if those parties see a huge rise in support, however determined the EU as a body is, the rest of the body, if those parties are wiped out, who knows what will happen?
We have at the moment, Natasha, Serbia is a candidate country, so it's been seeking to join the EU now for many years.
Yes.
But at the point that it was sort of inching forward into membership, it has now erupted politically. Tell us a little bit about what is going on in Serbia at the moment and why, and then we might unpack the implications of that with, I guess, the sort of the strengthening of another one of these authoritarian-leaning strongmen and what that means for that sort of Orban-Erdogan little cohort.
Well, yes. Look, it's hard to answer. Nothing in Serbia is simple, including its language, grammar, and politics. And I mean, I've been coming back and spending a lot of time here for just over 10 years now. I got a fellowship in Australia, which allowed me to do what I want, a Sydney Myer fellowship. And I decided to come here and work with young people to run leadership programs and also do cultural projects. That was my call, nobody else's call. It feels like a very different country from the place to which I returned 10 years ago, which was just around the time the current political party gained power in Serbia. And so I think the changes here were incremental. I didn't pay much attention because I didn't come here to do politics. But it's sort of overtaken all of us quite quickly, especially since COVID. And the trigger for the current protests was the collapse of a railway station canopy in Novi Sad in November last year, and 16 people were killed in that collapse of a structure that had been recently renovated as part of China's Belt and Road initiative. And basically things exploded from there. Students took to the streets, and then there was violence against the students. And then the students kept demonstrating, and now I'm talking university and high school students, and they were joined quite quickly by creative and cultural workers who would turn up to performances with a bloody red hand as protests, because the protests, as they state, are essentially targeted at what they claim is criminal corruption, root and branch, through the government, through the public sector, with alignment with hooligans and criminals. So That started, and I'm still at that point. I was back in Australia by then, and I was thinking, oh well, it's the usual suspects, the usual rabble, as they say, young people and creatives. Then they were joined by doctors, lawyers, and then the big thing was the farmers joined in and drove their tractors to Belgrade in a convoy to protect students in front of the faculties which they were blockading. And then another really interesting development was war veterans from the 90s who, are not sort of kind of meek and mild and lamb-like, have also been turning up also to protect the students physically by standing in between the students and riot police. And we've also seen bikies, again, not the usual suspects, who've been protecting the students. One of the the students have also been walking in between major cities like Novi Sad, Niš, Kragujevac and Belgrade in these processions where people come out of their homes in villages to feed them. So it's very food focused. So food is a big part of what people have been doing to support the students. And that evokes in Serbia a lot of historical memories of the retreat of the Serbian army in World War I back through Albania. My Serbian grandfather fought with the Allies in Greece in that army. So it's a very big part of the national iconography. And also more recently, the processions of ethnic Serbs out of Croatia in Operation Storm in the 90s, which was one of the key ethnic cleansing moments of what Croatia calls its war of liberation from Yugoslavia. So they're pressing a lot of buttons with this, and also their demeanour is engaging. They are using social media like I've never seen it used before, including very, very clever memes on AI, and they're deploying a very dry sense of humour that Georgina is quite similar to the British sense of humour. It could be quite dark and very, very funny. So, and the modality of the protest has always been peaceful, and the protests usually include 16 minutes of silence at 11:52 in the morning, which is the time that the canopy fell. So that's been happening. There has been violence against the protesters, including people driving into demonstrators. A lot of women students have been hurt, but when I say a lot, not enough for there to be much mainstream attention in the West to this. So that's a really big question for me, is why there has not been more noise in the EU and more broadly around what's actually happening, because these are very, very large scale demonstrations. There was a huge one. The biggest was on the 15th of March in Belgrade, and estimates vary wildly depending on where you sit on the political spectrum. I'd say conservatively 500,000 people, possibly more. And it's alleged that someone in the regime, the government, because it was elected, in the government or associated with it, detonated a sound cannon, which is an unlawful weapon. And that allegation has only been tested by Russians who came to interrogate what happened.
So can I just, sorry to interrupt, but just to ask a question, that the protests were sparked by the collapse of this canopy, and the allegation there is that, it wasn't put up properly, and that there wasn't care for the citizenry. And and
that there was corruption involved in the, yes.
Yeah, so hence it not being stable, and it was shoddy, if you like, because money had been misused. But this has now fed into a broader movement against the government.
Yes.
And the reasons for that, would you say, are because of the direction that the government is taking, and that it does seem to be befriending the strong men in places like Hungary and Turkey, and particularly Russia?
I think, and also China.
Yeah.
And also the United Arab Emirates. So it's very the geopolitical constellation, the constellation of external powers who are actors in relation to Serbia is complicated. So Serbia sells arms to the Ukraine while being politically close to Putin. A lot of Serbs are pro-Trump because Biden was a hawk in the 90s in the Bosnian War, and before that they hated the Clintons because NATO bombed Yugoslavia in 1999.
So Serbia's actually selling weapons to
as I understand it
at the moment.
As I understand it. So I don't think there's, in terms of the conversations I have with people here, their concerns aren't so much, it seems to me, because I'm half in, half out, because I'm a dual citizen, yes?
Yeah.
It seems to me that people aren't really concerned about the bigger picture so much. They're more concerned about their own lives and the cost of living, which has risen astronomically since COVID. Price of real estate, especially in Belgrade, has escalated wildly, including because Serbia has received around 200,000 people, mainly young people, many IT and culture workers, leaving Putin's Russia. So if you go down the street to Belgrade today, you can sit in a restaurant and there'll be Russians, Ukrainians, Serbs, Americans, Chinese people, all at the same table, so to speak, which is very much in the Yugoslav tradition of being non-aligned, space which was neither of the East and the West. So the protests, I think, are a trigger to a kind of exhaustion around this country not having normalised itself since the terrible wars of the 90s. And there was a hope amongst some, a substantial part of the population that joining the EU would enable that. But Serbia has not been allowed into the club. And there's a sense that Europe hasn't supported pro-European Serbs enough. And so support for the EU has actually dropped off quite a lot, including because the EU doesn't seem to care what's happening here now. Now, I understand personally that there is a lot on, as Georgina has canvassed, but it's a little bizarre, this silence around what's happening. And actually, part of the student protests have involved a cycling mission called Tour de Strasbourg, where they cycled to Strasbourg to present their claims around human rights abuses, as they allege. And also, they just ran a marathon to Brussels. And along the way, were received very positively by local mayors and diaspora populations, Serbian diaspora populations in European countries. And also when they ran through Croatia, for example, in towns where you might have expected people not to welcome Serbs, they did. So it's been enormous and enormously affecting. And at the moment, in the front of the National Parliament in Belgrade is a construction called Chatsiland, which is taken over a public park called Pionirski Park in front of the Parliament. And there are many, 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 many tents in which Vučić houses and supports his support base. And there are a lot of rumours about what's going on in Chatsiland and what it represents. And there are rumours that there's a paramilitary force connected with him that may base itself there, but it's impossible to know what's actually going on because the media is so controlled here by the government. And so the only way one can get a sense of what's going on or might be going on is by constantly watching Instagram and TikTok, which I've been doing for 6 months. And a lot of that material is not in English either, so I've had to really stretch myself to get across what people are saying. And, my Serbian vocabulary on questions of human rights, authoritarianism, democracy and so on has expanded vastly. So it's been a bit of a deep dive.
We're talking about the divisions across Europe, and Europe's also horribly divided on Israel and Palestine. We have very, very different positions. Spain, the Prime Minister of Spain this week said that Israel was a genocidal state and it would no longer trade with them. You have Ireland's been quite strong, Norway outside of the bloc. But at the same time, you have Hungary, Germany, Italy standing strong with Israel, refusing to condemn what we can all see is a genocide. I was in Berlin a few weeks ago, standing at the Holocaust Memorial, taking it in, and just a block away, Israel's flag is flying very large, very proudly, and there's, this is it's a crisis for humanity, and the EU does not have a solid single position on it.
Yeah, Georgina, that does seem to be the case, that over the last few weeks, the EU has strengthened its position, or certain sections of the EU, should we put it that way, but have strengthened its position more broadly. And that includes some of the countries that haven't always been kind of pro-Palestine, including the Netherlands, for example, with a right-wing leader. What's your ton of take on that? Is it just simply now that the inhumane horror and carnage going on in Gaza is so great that everybody has to step up, even those who were previously reluctant? I mean, Germany still seems to be very much all in with Israel.
I mean, exactly as you say, that I think the scale of the horror we're seeing unfolding has really influenced the actions and the speeches of our European leaders, who really can't ignore the horrors in Gaza right now. Germany, of course, has history to contend with, and that will always be the issue. And here in Britain, it's sort of in terms of what's going on the streets, it's very, very difficult, because people are finding it a tight line to tread between being anti any kind of genocide and pro Hamas. And that's, not supporting terrorism, because Hamas is prescribed a terrorist organization here in the UK, but at the same time saying what's happening in Gaza is very, very wrong. And then there's all the sort of language nuances of anti-Semitism and what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And I think it really muddies the waters. I mean, it's a very fine line to tread.
I think a lot of this stuff.
I mean, it does seem. Sorry, Joe.
It's a similar line that needs to be tread across the Western world, but we also need to acknowledge that it's been weaponized horrifically to cover for genocide and war crimes. And, whether it's difficult or awkward to stand against this, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And it's incumbent upon us during these times to take those risks.
Well, it seems that Macron is canvassing the possibility of recognising Palestine as early as June. He's certainly out there seeing if he can get more supporters to take that position forward. Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of countries, such as Ireland and Spain, as you say, Dave, who've been long-term supporters of Palestine. But it does seem now to be spreading into some of the, it's going to come down to what Paris and Berlin think in the end.
We are seeing a bunch of Western Anglo leaders speak out now. And the implication there is that there's some sort of red line that has been crossed now, and that it wasn't crossed 18, 19 months ago. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think what's actually happening now is where they're feeling a freedom to speak because Gaza has been flattened and Israel has done that job. And so this is an attempt to salvage some reputations for the history books.
Dave, that's a very bleak position you've adopted there, but yeah.
Can I just say there's almost no conversation about this here. I was in Bosnia last year. I went to visit Sarajevo, which is the city I first went to in 1983, so I'm dating myself. And there was a lot of pro-Palestinian sentiment and graffiti and so on and so on. I was there during their film festival, and then here there isn't graffiti about Palestine, there isn't graffiti around Israel, there isn't anti-Semitic graffiti. So it's kind of a blank space here. And the conversations here that have been about genocide and what it may be are still about Srebrenica and about the resolution that the UN passed last year, which against which the current Serbian president took a very strong stand against the resolution. So that's just one example to illustrate what I think is the fact that the former republics of Yugoslavia have still not processed the atrocities of the 90s and their roles in them. And there has been, one of the things that people do talk about here is the need for a lustration process where people are called to account for all kinds of behaviours, not just in wars, but also in terms of criminal behaviours. The Prime Minister of Serbia was notoriously assassinated around 20 years ago, Zoran Djindjic, after Milosevic. So I just want to say it's really different here, and I was really struck because I flew from Australia through Finland, and then came overland, and then through Finland, Austria, and Hungary, where there were big demonstrations on the streets against Orban. And then I came back here into this place that's strangely detached from the things that everybody else is talking about. So I don't have any simple way of summarizing why. I've got some theories, but we're kind of in a bubble here, and I would be interested to see if Serbia had normalized itself as per the demands of many processes. I'd be very curious about, Dave, about where Serbia would be standing in all of this. So we live in interesting times.
We do live in very interesting times. Georgina, do you have any insight? I mean, Natasha was talking before about that the EU had been strangely silent on some of these uprisings which are taking place around Europe, and particularly with a candidate country like Serbia. It does seem unusual that when you've had 500,000 people on the streets, that the EU hasn't had anything to say. Do you think it is, as Natasha suggested, it's because there's so many other things going on, and particularly Ukraine, having to deal with Hungary? I mean, I was aware that Hungary is basically trying to outlaw their Pride March from taking place, and it has sparked more conversations about the way that Hungary is trying to hold the EU to ransom on a whole range of issues, but particularly around potentially defence, and which will only become sharper points of conflict with the US receding from that front.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think Hungary is sucking up a lot of the oxygen in the room. There's so much for the EU to contend with. But I think also when it comes down to dealing with the broader kind of foreign policy, we really have to look very, very closely at the United States, because the fact that the US is basically pulling out as the global leader, as the big brother, completely resets everything. And suddenly Europe, I think, feels very much on its own, and it will become clear within the next few months how that's going to pan out. But this is a seismic shift in the way that we deal with things, if indeed the US is no longer a reliable partner.
which it seems that it is not. And even though you have people like Orban being great mates with Trump, that doesn't seem to mean that he's actually more interested and invested in particular parts of Europe. He just likes them to bow down and to take the knee in front of him, but it doesn't mean he's going to visit them with any extra largesse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all about Trump worship. This is a giant ego that just needs people to appease him in the way that a small child needs it. And I think, once we recognize that, and a lot of people have, I think you've seen a lot of, I was very impressed by Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African leader, who, following Zelensky's utter kind of humiliation at the hands of Trump and Vance, had clearly been very, very carefully briefed and dealt with Trump in a kind of sensible way, while Trump sat there completely lying, making up things about South Africa that simply weren't true. And Ramaphosa kind of just took it, was dealing with it like you would deal with a small child.
It was saying, I wish I had a plane to give you too.
And he said, I'd take it.
Yeah, he did. And he would, that he would.
Well, one interesting detail is there's a proposal of a property development in central Belgrade in the old former Ministry of Defence building that was bombed as a target in the 1999 NATO bombing. And it's been sitting there as a protected cultural memorial to that conflict since 1999. And now Trump's son-in-law, Jared is proposing to turn it into a luxury residential and commercial development. Many people here are not happy about that, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And then the New York Times did a story recently alleging that one of the key documents to enable this culturally protected monument to be developed was forged. So that's just a small encapsulation of the complexity.
Forged at the Serbian end.
Forged at the Serbian end. And I stress it's an allegation, but the story, it's just a little interesting microcosm of how complicated things are here. And the question of the redevelopment of Belgrade for profit, including by investors from the United Arab Emirates in relation to a development called Belgrade Waterfront, has also been something that triggered earlier protests a few years ago, because large chunks of land were appropriated for this kind of high-rise that people have concerns about, partly because they feel that the physical nature of Belgrade will start to resemble Dubai, and many Serbs are not happy with that. So, and it was recently revealed that the plans for that Belgrade waterfront development are mooted to stretch over a much larger part of the city. And so the physical infrastructure and the cityscape, and some would say the soul of this country, of this city and the country, is being changed. And it's difficult to know what else people can do apart from demonstrate, given that the opposition has been somewhat missing in action and very underwhelming, I'd say. So again, it's so different in Australia. You know, we turn up, we all have to vote, we get our democracy sausage, and we can be fairly confident that the results of the election represent the views of Australians at that moment. But it's very different here.
And it is interesting the way that...
My 25-hour flight
from
Australia over to Europe, I flew Emirates through Dubai, and I was bombarded with ads for new Trump hotels all across the Middle East. We've seen that AI video that he put out for a Trump hotel on the waterfront of Gaza on top of Palestinian corpses. And now we're seeing this.
Yes,
is this entire presidency a real estate con? It feels incredibly like it. We've never seen corruption this blatant and open before in my lifetime.
Well, no, and it's interesting that it's even coming up in this discussion about Serbia. Now, I wasn't aware that, Jared Kushner and Trump's kind of tentacles extend that far, that there are microcosms going on all over the world of these blatant corruption for, financial gain in the Trump family. It is kind of incredible. And you're also seeing, as I was looking at some of the results of the Romanian elections recently, the kind of the Trump playbook, where when you lose, you allege that that the election was rigged, and you try and claw your way back into power through the courts and through somehow destabilizing the legitimacy of the political systems overall. I mean, that was fortunately an unsuccessful strategy by the Romanian opponent, George Simeon, who went down to a former mathematician, I was pleased to see, and centrist mayor of Bucharest, Nucurja Dan. We do have, Georgina, as well, the runoff in Poland for the Polish presidency taking place this week as well. And it is again a sort of centrist establishment figure who was expected to do better in the first round, up against not quite hard right. He's not the equivalent of the Alternative für Deutschland, but he is certainly a populist kind of figure. And the polls are tracking a lot closer than had been expected there as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think Poland had this great hope in Donald Tusk, who of course has this wonderful EU background and everything. And now we're not sure. I mean, what they're saying, certainly today, the papers here are saying that the presidential election is too close to call, and it shows the difference between the pro-European. I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong. It is Rafał Trzaskowski.
Trzaskowski.
Yeah.
I had a look at that too.
And the nationalist Karol Nawrocki. It's within the margin of error. Both candidates have been out and about today campaigning, and it's quite extraordinary. I believe that the race will be decided by somewhere around 260,000 votes. I mean, that really is very, very tight.
There's just so much volatility everywhere, and certainly you've made me a little bit more nervous of the comments that you made at the start of this discussion, Georgina, because it does feel that things could go either way, and if they go the wrong way, we don't know what the possible implications of all of that could be.
I don't know how you future-proof for what is an unknown. As you say, we don't know how things are going to turn out. And if you look back and you think, oh, well, in Germany in the 1930s, why weren't they doing X, Y, and Z to prepare for something that they could clearly see was on the horizon? We're in that position now, but we don't know what to prepare for or how to do it.
Natasha, how do you think that the Serbian students are preparing as we prepare to wrap up our conversation?
I don't know. They just keep going. There's a lot of the government has accused them of driving a so-called colour revolution, and claimed that they're supported by foreign powers and foreign-funded NGOs. It's not a new line of attack in this country. I don't know. They're a lot younger than us, Joe. They just kind of keep going, and they keep going and going and going, and then they change tactics. So I don't know how they keep going. But what's very interesting is it seems that they don't feel that they have no alternative because they want to stay in Serbia. They don't want to go to the West. They want to live here, and they want to have what they call more normal options and more normal lives. And there's something very admirable about that. I remember when I was that age and at university in Canberra, and I wasn't really involved in the world in the way that they are involved in the nation building project, if you like. So yes, my prediction for them is they will just keep going, because I think they feel that they have nothing to lose.
Yeah, I think it's very different certainly growing up in Australia, you do feel
Yes.
removed from that kind of the front line and where, you know, shit gets real over there. Dave,
Yep.
where are you heading to next? And what would your final observation be from your European sojourn so far?
I'm heading back to Berlin to see Jerry Cantrell from Alice in Chains, one of my favorite bands. So I'm doing that in about a week. And what I've just traveling across, I've seen Palestinian flags in windows. I have seen spray paint everywhere. I have seen lots of that outpouring just from ordinary people more than from governments. And I suppose my final thought is this week, Anthony Albanese did use some of his strongest language, but I would just reiterate what Nasser Mashni said on the ABC before his interview was pulled, that Israel's genocidal intent has been obvious for a very long time now. And I think this is a face-saving exercise on the Prime Minister's part and should be treated thusly, really.
Georgina, any final comments or observations that you would like to make about the volatile times in which we're living before you get in your car and go to the lovely Hay Literary Festival, where it will feel like a very long way away?
You know, I'm really conscious of not strapping on a tinfoil hat. You know, that there are so many conspiracy theories, so much fake information. As Natasha was saying, a lot of internet-driven stuff going on where she is. And I think we just have to fact check and fact check and fact check. That's our responsibility as journalists, but I also think it's our responsibility as citizens. We can no longer take anything for granted. We need to make sure that what we're being told is the truth. And I mean, even when you look at various elections, people have been lied to, have voted for people on the strength of complete falsehoods. And it's important that we just keep our wits about us. It's down to all of us now. We can work together, but on an individual level, we have to make sure that we are not being taken in by anyone.
Well said.
Can I jump in? I'd say I'd recommend everyone read the work of Lily Lynch, who's much younger than us, journalist. She's originally American. She spent time in the Balkans and in Turkey. She's got a Substack called Lily Lynch and writes pretty widely. I think her angle of approach is something I find really useful. So that's my tip.
Excellent. All right. Well, you heard it here. Lily Lynch will give insight. I want to thank Georgina and Natasha for joining us from just outside of Belgrade and London, respectively. Thank you all, viewers, for watching us, our European special on the Sunday Shot. Do feel free to subscribe to our channel and to send a few dollars our way so that we can stay on air. We will be back next week on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Thank you.